Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am joined by my nemesis, my frenemy, my good friend, Dr. Philip Chase. Hello, Philip.
Hello, AP. How are you this very fine day?
Well, I'm doing very good because we have another special guest with us today, author Ian C. Esslemont, author of Blood and Bone, which is the book that we're going to be discussing. Book 5 of the novels of the Malazan Empire. Numbers are hard for me, Cameron. I do my best. I'm a word person.
Hello.
Great so how are you doing today, Cameron?
Just fine, thank you. And it's great to be here. And hello, AP and Philip. Nice to see you all again.
No, as a proviso, when we have done these talks before, occasionally I suffer internet problems. So in case that happens, if any of the screens freeze, it's not bad editing on my part. It's because of the internet connection. I got the excuse in early.
And so, hopefully you'll get this freezing at a completely awkward moment too.
So, Cameron, we obviously Philip and I recently did a read through, and we got to Blood and Bone. We read Blood and Bone, and there's a spoiler-free video on Philip's channel, and there's a spoiler discussion on my channel. And I don't know if you have watched them or had a chance to go through them, but I thought this would be a great chance for us to talk to you about this book, because in my estimation, this is one of the best renderings of, or evocations of, the jungle setting. And I know that you have personal experience of it. So I thought one of the things that we could talk about is the jungle as a setting, why you chose that, and also like what you were drawing on.
Right. Well, one of the things that I was responding to was this older view of the fantasy genre as being limited only to sort of pseudo-Northern European settings, and how that's a limit of the genre, that it's always just depicting pseudo-medieval worlds set in Northern Europe, and relatedly with Northern peoples, or stand-ins of that race or kind. And so I was responding to that, and I could do it because I knew that I had, at least some limited exposure to a jungle setting. I was lived in Bangkok for 3 years. I was teaching English at a university in Bangkok with my wife. And every time we had a week or a weekend or some time off teaching, we would jump on the bus and head out to explore, and to Cambodia, Laos, Indonesia, Malaysia, Java, Sumatra, and we tried to cover a lot of ground. And while we were there, it was a wonderful and privileged experience, to have a base there and to be able to take your time and sort of, as long as you wanted, to go to a certain area and look around. And the privilege of being white and moneyed in comparison as well. That freedom of movement is a privilege, and we were keenly aware of that. This is all, of course, related to a lot of what's going on in the book. And not only is the genre often pointed to as being too limited in its geographical representations, when it does try to move to another setting, another ecological, environmental area, say grasslands or steppe or what have you, often what happens is we get the people of that area, region, not being given full agency. not being treated in a fully round way, just being props or used to further plot lines or to further a stand-in for a white savior, for example. And I wanted to respond to that as well.
Yeah, I would say that you responded brilliantly, especially considering if there is, well, there are lots of threads in the book, but for me, one of the most important characters of all is, and please correct my pronunciation if it's wrong, but Sang, is that how you would pronounce that?
Yeah, it's a Thai name, it's close. It's sort of like past tense, we sang.
Okay, Sang. All right, very good. Yeah, and she is a central character, obviously, and a native of Jacuruku, and someone who is very much in touch with the jungle setting that you've provided here, which, by the way, I want to mention to you on camera that one of the most common responses, for me, the responses that stuck out on my channel when we released the spoiler-free video was to have several people who had been to Thailand and had been to Southeast Asia and had been in these jungles say to me that you absolutely nailed it. You evoked that setting very successfully, and they felt like they were put right back in that place as they were reading the book. So obviously you did something right there in respect to conjuring the atmosphere of this book. And I've always said while reading your books that I'm a huge admirer of your ability to create atmosphere. But this one seems to really just kind of grab people and who just feel, especially those who've been there, who feel like, wow, this is it. He just nailed this. So well done.
Well, thank you. And of course, it's not the only fantasy novel. It has gone, to other environs and such. I'm not trying to claim anything like that. I just tried to give it justice.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to follow up on that too, I think in relation to what you were talking about representation and such, in the acknowledgements of the book of Blood and Bone, you write that you, with gratitude and acknowledging your time at the University of Minnesota, where you were pursuing your interest in 19th century travel writing, colonial texts, and the myths of imperialism. So I am really hoping that we can talk about the relevance of these three things: 19th century travel writing, colonial texts, and the myths of imperialism in relation to this book, and how these areas of study inspired you to do what you did in Blood and Bone. And it's something I think that it's fair to say that we see throughout the Malazan series, and I mean all the series. So novels of the Malazan Empire and Paths to Ascendancy and the Malazan Book of the Fallen and all the series. These themes are fairly prevalent, I would say. But I think that the expression of them in Blood and Bone is unique. So if you don't mind talking about the relationship of 19th century travel writing, colonial texts, and the myths of imperialism to Blood and Bone, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I chose to really center on the travelogue for this particular project. And I think as you guys mentioned in your talks, one of the main vehicles is, of course, the journey. And so we are on many journeys in this book, and not just physical journeys, but journeys of self-awareness. And the travelogue is one of the main narrative frames of imperialist literature.
Right.
It comes out of an assumed privilege, a privilege of mobility, and being able to enter into a community, a region, and walk through it and evaluate it, and take your notes, and then you return to the metropole, to the homeland, and you are the interlocutor, you're the interpreter of that region, and you create a body of knowledge that represents that area to the metropole. And so I wanted to use that method in the novel, and to critique it as sort of all of the problems that arise from that.
Interesting. Yeah. When you say travel writing, I think of, and it's older, it's 18th century, and it's totally fictional, but I think of Gulliver's Travels, which does feature some of the things you mentioned.
Oh yeah.
But with the European going into other lands and being the interlocutor and the go-between who explains these faraway exotic places to his European audience and so on and so forth. Although Swift, you have to say, is incredibly aware of what he's doing the whole time, and he's actually using it in a very, I would suggest, subversive way in some respects, because he's critiquing Europeans while he's doing it. So he's doing it very knowingly.
He is certainly the exception in many ways in that regards, because many of the other texts were in no way as self-aware or satirical. So I'm more in this sort of infamous period. I found myself drawn further and further away from the fiction, into looking at the nonfiction. And so, for example, the journals of Livingston, the journals of Stanley, and then focusing on the South Seas, actually. And what I saw was a culture clash. And so you're looking at Cook's journals, and this meeting of two very diverse traditions and peoples and attitudes and worldviews coming together and clashing. And that's where I was going to focus on for my dissertation.
Interesting. So is it fair to say that the epigraphs in Blood and Bone are echoes of a sort, or Malazan versions of these travel narratives?
Yeah, many are drawn from a number of these more famous nonfiction travel reports from those regions, or episodes of it, famous episodes of it. Say, for example, Mahout, Henri Mahout, who is sort of the French explorer who goes up into Cambodia and discovers the remains of the Khmer civilization.
But one of the things that I find fascinating, particularly about the travelogue writing, is in terms of narrative perspective, it always seems to be framed from that position of the privileged European view looking in, and everything is told from that. And we see that in what you do with the epigraphs. But then obviously the main body of the writing, you have some examples of people from the region giving their view, and then contrasting examples from other people in the region who are from a different background and their view. And it's even within what an external perspective looking in would go, the assumption of homogeneity. But within that, anytime we get within a culture, you see that is actually more complex, that there's the external perspective assumes homogeneity, but when we're within a culture, we see the heterogeneity of the entire thing. And it's one of the most fascinating aspects of Blood and Bone as a novel for me, because Tsang's attitude in comparison and in contrast to the other people of Jacuruku, depending on where they are from and what background and what culture, they all have very different views of the jungle.
And the main point of view, our sort of POV, has their point of view and is attempting to impose a certain rhetorical stance on what they're seeing, and be it erasure, for example, or primitivization. And I'm trying to point out that how they are falling apart. and they might think they're being successful in imposing that view, but the facade is breaking.
And it's interesting how the different so we're really speaking of the thaumaturgs, right? Who are these? They're the imperialistic people on Jacuruku, and it's interesting how you have different responses among them to that breaking down. You have, on the one hand, you have the commander of the Army of Righteous Chastisement, Golan, who makes his way all the way through the jungle and to the other side of the continent, all the way to the beach, and seemingly hasn't learned a whole lot. We need to talk about that thread. But you also have Ponlor, who I think is an example of someone with that same indoctrination, with that same worldview of superiority, being taught in a very sometimes harsh way, a lesson in empathy, a lesson in humanity. And he's a bit slow, but he does it gradually. He's not like the Malazan mage who learns right away. Sour, who embraces what he sees around him and learns from them. And so that's the opposite of that kind of arrogance. But Ponlor eventually, he does need to get knocked on the head to be helped along, but he does eventually learn this, doesn't he?
Well, it's hard to have your worldview shifted. You know, I mean,
yeah.
We're also ingrained. It's very difficult to. It's a hard lesson, and that's what you guys were talking about in your spoiler and spoiler-free discussions. The self-realization and acceptance. It's really difficult to sort of reach that point for a person, and as you said, letting go, realizing that you have no control. And we have people coming into a region assuming that they have full control of the situation and of themselves and of everything that's going on, but then it's sort of revealed that that's not the case, even though they might write back home and say everything's great and we are chastising even as I write, things like that.
Yeah.
But it's one of the aspects I really liked was the relationship between Merc and Sar, because one of the expressions that we often hear about, someone from a civilized land who goes off to these far reaches of the world, and we hear they went native, and it's almost always framed as a pejorative. It's almost always framed as a negative. And we see that reflected in the initial assumptions about him going native. And yet, as we go through, we, along with Merc, gradually learn to appreciate the reasons why. And it's that slow shifting of perception, that slow learning, that I think is so important. Because it's not a didactic, don't criticize people for this, but it's to explore both of those different things. The initial assumption about someone going native and this is bad, and then exploring the reasons why someone does that. That native approaches, indigenous approaches to the environment are there and are learned and are taught for a reason. And just because we're external to it and we have our own way of doing things doesn't mean that we can't learn from it. And I thought that was a really interesting way to approach quite a challenging subject. Particularly, like let's look at the visuals here. This is three white guys talking about this.
I was going to point that out. Yes, I mean, here we are, three privileged white males. How dare we? But we will venture forth in any case.
Just like the army of righteous chastisement.
But
absolutely, let's hope we feel better.
Well, before we just to address that, we are three white guys. I can't change where I was born or how I was born or what I was born into, but what I can change is attempt to learn more and research things and address things. And that is always done in stages. It's never a complete process. And this is a stage. Like we're talking to you, an author who has experiences that I don't have, so I can learn from you. You traveled to those areas, you engaged with local culture, you engaged with going to all these things. So it's always a process of learning, and we can't choose who we start off as. What we can choose is what we're doing with our future. And like, I appreciate the visual of three white guys talking about imperialism, and I know, but
yeah, I mean, how dare
this is a step along the way. This is not the be all and end all and end of the discussion and end of learning. It's a step. So I like to recognize that it's not a perfect situation, but it's the first step in a journey of learning, which is something you emphasize in the book. These journeys are both physical as well as internal. Like, you explore that, you literalize that metaphor of the journey, as well as showing it in different ways.
So going native, yes. That's a classic imperial narrative. And it's especially applicable to the South Seas, where there was considered such a danger to the imperial representatives. And the reason, in many ways, that it was so frowned upon and considered a terrible thing is that the whole structure was based on a racial hierarchy, right? And that was founded in the very blood and the very genes of all the people involved. And so if you moved from somewhere in that hierarchy and you joined the native community, then you were showing that that's actually not a rigid structure, that it's fluid. And that is a very great threat to imperial authority. So they're making a great, that had to be stomped out, and it had to be denied or derided or shown to be some sort of a flaw of the individual. And because many of the individuals who did this were sailors, like deckhands, people who jumped ship, it was considered a character flaw. That's how it was framed, as a moral depravity. And so it was dismissed in that way.
This is one of the central myths of imperialism that you allude to in the acknowledgements. The idea, and I think it's fair to say that we sort of recognize a hardening of theories about race in the 19th century, the period that you studied. Whereas, not that racism didn't exist in the Renaissance or even in medieval times, it certainly did, but I think it was less institutionalized, perhaps, less hardened. And so they were still figuring out their racism during those times.
It gained a scientific foundation, which gave it more authority in this period. But what also came out of the South Seas and Africa and other regions of colonial contact was the opposite narrative, which is that culture is plastic and it's malleable and it can change. And this is where anthropology finds the roots of its discipline. And so we have, Malinowski among the Trobriand Islanders, I believe it was, and Levi Strauss in the South Seas as well. And their research and stories of culture contact give rise to the opposite, not of an opening up and realization of commonality. So,
and the rise of the perceived evolutionary structure and Darwinism, and this idea of the highly evolved, and then anyone who didn't match that image, usually of the white colonial or imperial oppressor, anyone who was less than that was viewed as further down the evolutionary tree. And that's a lot of the political cartoons at the time. Anytime someone was viewed as coming from a culture or a part of the world that was not as well respected or not viewed as civilized, was usually cast in those more ape-like terms. And a lot of the political cartoons in the UK at the time depicted the Irish that way. And like we see that line of faulty reasoning still applied today. You know, it's one of those things that we've never gotten away from. We've never learned about the error of this, that it's such an easy narrative to fall into. And it has all of that appearance of being backed up by science, but that's not what the science proves. So it's all about that cultural perception and that perception of how you create this narrative about other people and how you impose that narrative on other people.
And that colonial stance, it relies upon a fixity of lines. There's a delineation of us, them, groups, tribes that has to be fixed and has to be respected and has to withstand time. But in Blood and Bone, I'm hoping we can see how actually everything is very fluid. Identity is much more fluid. Group identities are fluid. And we have the, I think it's Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, right? That nationalism and ideas of groups as having some sort of pure, fixed essence is a myth. That we're all motley mixed mongrels, and all of us going back all the way through time, not just in the 19th or 18th or 17th century in Europe, but all over the world. And in all communities are always changing and melding, even if they may want to hold on to some sort of legendary identity that's hundreds of thousands of years old. But that is that's the anthropology and archaeology coming through.
Yeah, well, I would say that you expose the falsity of these myths of imperialism quite effectively in both comedic and in tragic ways in Blood and Bone. And the comedic one is, I think, quite obviously the Army of Righteous Chastisement, where you have the principal scribe, whose name is Thorn, in this wonderful relationship with the Commander Golan. And there's this back and forth going on between them where Thorn is so overdoing the bombacity of the imperial narrative as he's recording their mighty conquest of the jungle, that it's a subversion, isn't it? And it's funny, but it's also effectively showing us the falsity of this stance of superiority. It's ridiculous. They're absolutely ludicrous when they emerge from the jungle on the other side of the continent on the beach, you know, in tatters, and just a few of them left. And the commander makes a sort of a half-assed effort to sort of, you know, oh, second in command, that's not standard issue, that drag you're wearing on your head now, is it? And I mean, it just exposes how silly it is, but it is also tragic. It has tragic repercussions in here, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. And yet, if they manage to get back, you have to ask, well, which version will be the one that gets enthroned? You know? Yeah. And you can guess which version. And yeah, I mean, he's doesn't make the commander Golan certainly doesn't have any sort of moment of realization, but he is stroking his chin at the end and thinking, wait a minute, something's not right.
Yeah. And I just wonder, so Thorn is he deliberately subverting the narrative by overdoing it?
I think so, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm
sorry.
So yeah, we have the Thorn, and then we also have a prick, right? We have both in the novel, and I would hope that he's trying to show Golan something, and it's not his place to speak up, but he's trying to show him.
Okay, so very similar to what's going on between Osirk in the Dead House and our Jagat friend Gothos. So, and who, by the way, Gothos is the prick in the book. So the thorn and the prick are both delivering a sharp little lesson here, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, you can only, you can't force it. You can only try and make people see it. And it's one of those things you are only allowed to, as they say, lead the horse to water. And as educators, you can lay out a banquet, but if no one's hungry, they're not going to. They have to partake.
But the Osirk part is the internal narrative that AP was talking about. Is that what you were talking about earlier, AP, in terms of the inner journey is it's reflected in that interaction between Osirk and Gothos?
Yeah, ultimately, it's always an interior. You have to make those. Try to come to some kind of terms and realization. And we see the most simply with Osirk. He has to make that. He doesn't have to, but he knows there's something there, and he wants to pursue it back through his life and in his internal journey. Yeah.
Well, one of the points I wanted to raise was the atmosphere of horror in the book, and the incidents and descriptions of horror in the book. And one of the things that I find really very interesting about it, and I actually forgot to mention this in our discussion, was how the jungle initially was the source of horror. That as we start the book and we go in, the jungle is strange, the jungle is frightening, the jungle is full of these fears, these horrors, and these terrible things that happen to people. But as the book progresses, as we accept the jungle as the environment that we are in, the true horror that we see in the book is actually in the thaumaturg city. It's what they do to other humans, to their own people, and how they have been taking people from the villages, and some of them they have been experimenting on, and others they have been turning into new thaumaturgs. And you suddenly realize the artificial construction of the thaumaturgs as distinct and separate to all of the villages, because all of the thaumaturgs are originally from the villages, and so are their victims that they experiment on in terms of education. And it's such a cold, clinical, frightening horror that we see when we descend into the bowels of that city, that we see what they have been, the havoc and the horror that they've been wreaking. And that contrast, that movement from the jungle as a source of horror to the civilized city and the civilization and the imperial authority as the true source of horror, I thought that was a really interesting journey and transition across the novel.
Yeah, the true source of coming into an unfamiliar environment, you don't know, it's unknown, and so of course you're trepidatious and you project fears onto the environment, but with familiarity and with understanding, and they sort of begin to accept more, like sour, and and so then the question is, well, where's the real horror lie, and we have to sort of find it.
Because the one thing about that, and it's a strange perhaps comparison, because maybe you weren't thinking of this, but those experiments on the humans reminded me very much of the horrors that we found out about in World War II, and the experiments on humans to advance medical knowledge, and even the moral dilemma that the Allies faced when they found all of that research about, well, what do you do with research that has been conducted in that way, that is incredibly valuable, but is just drenched in human horror, tragedy, misery, pain, suffering, and the worst imaginable things. It's truly immoral. But what do you do with the research? And when that scene of them descending into the bowels of the city to see those things and the experiments that the thaumaturgs were running, I had all of those images and stories of the World War II Nazis experimenting on the prisoners in the concentration camps. Like that came flooding to the fore. And again, the lie, the justification of, oh, this is for the greater good, and how easily we blind ourselves to the suffering of those people.
Yeah.
I was thinking of bodies, actually, the human body. And you guys have touched on it in your discussions. And it's all about identity. And where does your body end? Where does it begin in the environment, right? One of the other imperial legacies, not just from imperial literature and colonialism, is a view of yourself as separate from nature, from the environment that you're in. So one of the things I was looking at was that where's that line, that delineation? And so we have bodies being taken apart, bodies being invaded, the body being violated in many different ways.
Yeah. That insistence on not only our separation from nature, but our superiority to it is, I think, the explanation for a lot of the destruction we've wrought in the world. And oftentimes it really is what leads us to put ourselves in opposition to nature. We often speak of man versus nature. Nature's indifferent. It doesn't put itself into opposition. We're the dummies who, through our own arrogance, put ourselves in these places. So we're the ones who build on wetlands. We're the ones who build on floodplains. We're the ones who cause climate change, and so on and so forth. And then we say, wow, that nature really doesn't like us, does it? So that it's that arrogance, because we have this amazing, enhanced cranial capacity and these opposable thumbs, that we've been able to conquer the world and feel our superiority. Once in a while, though, we are reminded of our place, I think. And it's something that you do beautifully in this book, in Blood and Bone, as the characters are swallowed by the jungle. And some learn, like Sour, to embrace that, to be one with it, to be part of it. And Merc eventually learns, not only through Sour, but through his relationship with Celeste, I would say. That becomes very important as well. So it is something I think that you do beautifully in here, and it's so central. The jungle as really a symbol of a broader kind of nature, I think, is really well done in here. And I thought of Mirkwood when I was reading the book. Sometimes I don't know if that was at all deliberate on your part or not, but the idea of Bilbo and the dwarves going in there and feeling that this place is threatening, this place is foreign, this place is other, and it's dangerous. But there's a side of it that's beautiful at the same time. There's a beauty to be seen there. And if you stop seeing yourself in opposition to, you stop trying to conquer, you might be able to learn to live with it the way the people within the jungle have, the way they live, who are looked at as exotic and strange and bizarre by the people who are coming in to conquer it.
And this is just one example. You can apply it to the North American prairies.
Yep.
There, the metaphor wasn't jungle, but it was wasteland and wilderness that had to be tamed. So it's all across the frontiers and regions of colonial expansion and contact. And it's the same story over and over again. But we see little things, like in the Arctic, famously, of course, between Scott and Amundsen. Scott insisted on using ponies, I think, Siberian ponies. I might be wrong. But Amundsen looked at the Inuit and saw that they used dog sleds. Yeah. And so he said, hey, I'm going to use dogs. I'm not going to use ponies. And who made it to the North Pole? Amundsen. So. One example.
Yeah. Fancy that, doing things the way the people who've lived there for hundreds or thousands of years have done it and gotten along pretty well.
Yeah, but we still haven't learned up here in Alaska. We have homes that are built using techniques and models based on the lower 48 codes and standards. So, homes that work well in California, say, or Texas, the same homes being built in the north.
Or even in the American suburbs, our insistence on having a green grass lawn in like LA or something, where you have to water it constantly to have that. It doesn't go there, right? But we just insist on duplicating this thing over and over and over again. Yeah.
Bringing our models with us and imposing them everywhere.
Yep. That's why I thought Osirk was such a great character in here too, because I don't know a ton about him, but I know he's Thais Leosan. And what I do know about the Thais Leosan is that they have a tendency to impose their world order on everyone else, that they're coming from a place of righteousness. So in that respect, he's a bit like the army of imperial chastisement. And that's the place he's coming from. And he's been humbled by this experience with Gothos in the Dead House, and kind of having that inner journey and realizing these things about himself, I think is all these things fit together beautifully thematically. They really do.
Well, I hope. Yeah, and just being able to be humbled alone that's growth. Because there are many who are inured to that, just are incapable of self-reflection.
Can we talk about Celeste a little bit, perhaps, and the role that she plays in the story as a fragment of the crippled god, and her ultimate fate as well, but the beautiful relationship that evolves between her and Merc. I thought that was very touching, and how he comes to view her in a way as he never sheds that awe because she's a very powerful being, but nevertheless, he comes to think of her in an almost paternal way. He's protective of her in a way, and he tries his best, as you say in the story, to not do what his father did. He's going to do the opposite of whatever his father did in order to be a good father figure for her, recognizing that she's far more powerful and in some respects knowledgeable, but she's also very naive, isn't she? And that is something that I love what you did at the end, is the idea of part of her, I guess, becoming united with the jungle. She becomes part of it, even though I think what's going on is that there's an attempt to unite all the fragments of the crippled god, which is very much related to what's going on in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. So there's that narrative going on, but Celeste has her own story here too, doesn't she?
Yeah, I think that from her very, very, very distant point of view, there is you could almost say that there's no difference between, say, a person and the jungle Himatan itself. They're both entities, and so to her there's no difference between the two, from her great distance. Again, then Himatan itself has it has a body, and these individuals who are entering into the jungle are invading that body, and so it's reacting as defending itself, not overtly, but there, as in our own bodies, we have our white corpuscles and our antigens and defense mechanisms. So we've awakened that defense mechanism, and Celeste sees it as a body, and I think personally she manages to escape being unified with the larger shard, and to sit and manages to choose or to work and an identification with Himatan itself, which is already semi-aware, semi-spiritual land.
Yeah, there's that beautiful conversation between her and Merc that I read an excerpt from in one of the videos. I think it was in the spoiler-free one.
Mhm.
And that sense of transcendence, that sense of connection to other beings around one is something that it's again, and it's a beautiful Malazan theme, but I love this iteration of it through the character of Celeste and the idea of seeing oneself as not a separate entity within this body, like you were talking about before. We have this tendency to separate what's in this body from what's outside it. And that's something that gets, that separation is sort of taken apart in her part of the narrative. So I thought that was really beautiful and kind of like Buddhist, I guess, in a way. Would you say that Buddhist ideas are sort of something that informed that, or just sort of agree with that idea that you're putting forward there?
Definitely. Think about breath. Our torso, our body is actually hollow. We have two very large hollow cavities in our bodies. Our body is hollow. And when you breathe in, you're bringing the world into your body. Right? The world is entering you when you breathe in. And so we are not separate. We're actually contain part of the world within us every time we breathe. That's just one of the basic examples of studying breath. And that attitude is found, just happens to find itself being set forth in a lot of Eastern philosophies.
Yeah. Huh.
I won't claim to be a Buddhist scholar or anything, but when I was in Bangkok, I did some research and reading into it, and spoke with a lot of practicing Buddhists.
Yeah. There's I read a little bit myself. I'm not a scholar or practicing Buddhist, but I enjoy reading about philosophical Buddhism. And in particular, one book I've mentioned before in a Malazan context actually is Thich Nhat Hanh's The Heart of the Buddha's Teaching. And Thich Nhat Hanh he recently passed away, but he was a Vietnamese, I think, originally, Buddhist monk. But there was a wonderful passage in that book about comparing the human being to a wave on the ocean, and the wave sort of thinking it's a separate little happy wave, and it's got its own identity and it's its own thing and it's separate, but really the wave is part of all that water now, isn't it? And it will return to that water, and it was always part of that water as well.
And similar to this is the idea of letting go, and being able to relinquish expectations of control in the wider world. And we see individuals being taught that in harsh lessons sometimes, and other times just seeing it and realizing it. So.
Yeah, I think one of the other points was what we see about, say, like Skinner refusing to learn, refusing to relinquish control, refusing that position, and refusing to bend. And of course, he's punished for it because he won't learn the lessons and he won't be flexible. Whereas we see a lot of the other characters learn from their experiences, and they are changed. They do grow. It's not always pleasant. Like Asark doesn't end up in a much better place because of it, but it is part of growth. And growth is not always easy, and growth is not always without cost. But refusing to learn, refusing to grow, refusing to acknowledge these things is very rarely the thing to do.
Yeah. Kalor as well. He never learns, right?
Hashtag Kalor did nothing wrong.
Oh.
Well, we have Ardata, who's has the power to actually impose her. She could actually do something about it, and has for millennia, and that's sort of one of the roots of the difficulty of the region. It's unable to move on.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for this entire conversation, Cameron. This is great, and I love having these opportunities to get your view on it, because we can make suppositions, we can make guesswork based on the text about maybe what you were trying to do and what you were exploring, and maybe why you were doing it. And it's nice to find out that every once in a while, Philip and I are actually right.
It happens. We can make up stuff, though. We're pretty good at that.
Well, I can be, even in saying what I thought I was doing, I can be wrong. I mean, I'm reluctant because I'm very skeptical of authorial intent. I just, I don't want to impose some sort of intentionality here. So I'm reluctant.
You see, but I disagree with this. Authorial intent, you can have an intent about what you were trying to do, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the definitive reading of a text, and it doesn't necessarily mean that people have to read it that way. But expressing what you were trying to do is not insisting that people read it that way. So be proud of your intent. You're an author. You had intent. Be proud.
Embrace your intent.
Yeah, you're not dead. You're a living author. So.
But thank you very much for joining us, Cameron. And Philip, thank you for being here and engaging in all of this.
Oh, just a pleasure. Anytime I can meet with one of my favorite authors, it's a joy and an honor and a privilege. So thank you so much, Cam. And AP, thanks for letting me hang out here.
Great to speak.
And for those of you still watching, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and we will see you in the next one.